Welcome to Knowledge Voice. Today is episode 1 of the book Origin of Species by Natural Selection by Charles Darwin. About the author. Born on February 12, 1809 in Shropshire, England, to Robert Darwin and Susanna Wedgwood. Charles Darwin was the second youngest child of the family. He had 3 sisters and 2 brothers. His mother passed away in 1817. When Darwin was only 8 years old, Darwin was born into a wealthy family, which comprised of people who were famous for challenging traditionally accepted ideas. His grandfathers had been very important figures of their time. Josiah Wedgwood was an anti-slavery campaigner, and Erasmus Darwin had written about the controversial idea that one species could transmute into other in his book Junomania. Between 1818 and 1825, Charles Darwin attended the Anglican Shrewsbury School. Darwin's father was a doctor and hoped that his son would follow in his footsteps. At the age of 16, in 1825, Darwin was enrolled at Edinburgh University to earn a medical degree. However, he soon realized that it would be impossible for him to be a good doctor. Anesthesia had not been developed yet, so the methods of surgery filled Darwin with dread. His time at the university still proved to be useful, even though Darwin later claimed that he had learned very little there. Edinburgh University had a rich intellectual environment. He came to know of the continental sciences there, since the university was filled with radical students who studied them. He went to student societies and listened to people denying the divine design of human facial anatomy and arguing that humans and animals had similar mental faculties. During the time he spent at Edinburgh University, it became clear to Darwin that natural history fascinated him more than medicine. Charles Darwin abandoned his plan to become a doctor, much to the annoyance of his father, who then suggested that he should study to become a parson. Thus, Charles Darwin landed at Christ's College, Cambridge, to study theology. However, instead of studying, Darwin preferred to spend his time shooting and riding. At Cambridge, he got introduced into entomology and began collecting beetles, later publishing his findings in Illustration of British Entomology. He graduated in 1831. The next natural step was to work as a cleric, but there was another, far more exciting opportunity awaiting him. On the recommendation of his botany professor at Cambridge, John Stevens Henslow, Darwin jumped aboard the HMS Beagle, a ship of the British Royal Navy, on which he had been employed as a naturalist. He toured around the world for 5 years while exploring the coastline of South America, venturing into Brazil, Argentina, Chile, and remote islands of such as Galapagos, where the ship stopped for 5 weeks, returning to England in 1836, bringing specimens of plants, animals, fossils, and rocks with him. Darwin worked and made groundbreaking discoveries. They were revealed almost 2 decades later in a book that became one of the most important books ever written, The Origin of Species. In 1839, Charles Darwin married his first cousin, Emma Wedgwood, at St. Peter's, Anglican church in Mayer. The decision to marry had been taken after much deliberation, as can be seen from the pro and con list that Darwin had scribbled on the back of a letter to a friend, in bracket, such as terrible loss of time but a home and someone to take care of, bracket close. Emma was beautiful, well educated, accomplished, and a brilliant pianist. The couple had 10 children, 3 of whom died young. Theirs was a marriage unaffected by the completely different worldviews they had. Charles had openly discussed his doubts on the existence of God with Emma, and Emma had told him that she believed there was a heaven and a hell. Charles Darwin had entrusted Emma to publish his findings in case he died prematurely. Darwin's account of how he believed transmutation happened in the origin of species created a stir when it was published. Allegedly, even while writing its first draft, Darwin had been conflicted. His had been a Christian upbringing and his discoveries went against his faith. He also knew that his findings, when revealed to the world, will become controversial for advocating something that went completely against what was in the Bible. This may be the reason behind Darwin waiting for 2 decades before going public. Darwin may have never published his book if not for the letter he got from Alfred Russel Wallace in 1858. Wallace, who admired Darwin, had arrived at the theory of natural selection on his own and wanted Darwin's advice on how to publish it. Darwin then realized that if he delayed publishing his book any longer, Wallace would end up taking credit for something he had discovered first. The book was published on November 24, 1859, its complete original title being On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection or the Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. Unsurprisingly, it drew fierce criticism from the church. The people who followed the Christian faith believed that God himself had shaped human beings after his image. To their horror, here was a man claiming that humans had a common ancestors with apes. Darwin garnered fame and respect for his other notable work as well, such as The Voyage of the Beagle, 1839, The Variation of Animals and Plants Under Domestications, 1868, The Descent of Man, 1871, The Expression of the Emotion in Man and Animals, 1872, and many others. Considered the most notable scientist of his time, whose striking discoveries revolutionized how we understand life and the world, and who unfurled how living organisms came to be. Charles Darwin breathed his last at the age of 72 on April 19, 1882. At his family home, he was buried in Westminster Abbey, London. Introduction. Note: the introduction is written in the language of Charles Darwin, means here I refers to him, Charles Darwin. When on board HMS Beagle as naturalist, I was much struck with certain facts in the distribution of the organic being inhabiting South America and in the geological relations of the present to the past inhabitants of that continent. These facts, as will be seen in the later chapters of this volume, seem to throw some light on the origin of his species, that mystery of mysteries, it has been called by one of our greatest philosophers. On my return home, it occurred to me in 1837 that something might perhaps be made out of this question by patiently accumulating and reflecting on all sorts of facts which could possibly have any bearing on it. After 5 years' work, I allowed myself to speculate on the subject and drew up some short notes. These I enlarged in 1844 into a sketch of the conclusions, which then seemed to be probable. From that period to the present day, I have steadily pursued the same object. I hope that I may be excused for entering on these personal details as I gave them to show that I have not been hasty in coming to a decision. My work is now, 1859, nearly finished, but as it will take me many more years to complete it, and as my health is far from strong, I have been urged to publish this abstract. I have more especially been induced to do this as Mr. Wallace, who is now studying the natural history of the Malay archipelago, has arrived at almost exactly the same general conclusions that I have on the origin of species. In 1858, he sent me a memo on the subject with a request that I would forward it to Sir Charles Lyell, who sent it to the Linnean Society, and it is published in the third volume of the Journal of that society. Sir C. Lyell and Dr. Hooker, who both knew of my work, the latter having read my sketch of 1844, honored me by thinking it advisable to publish, with Mr. Wallace's excellent memo, some brief extract from my manuscripts. This script abstract, which I now publish, must necessarily be imperfect. I cannot here give references and authorities for my several statements, and I must trust to the reader reposing some confidence in my accuracy. No doubt, errors may have crept in, through I hope I have always been cautious in trusting to good authorities alone. I can here give only the general conclusion at which I arrived, with a few facts in illustration, but which I hope in most cases will suffice. No one can feel more sensible than I do of the necessity of hereafter publishing in detail all the facts, with references, on which my conclusion have been grounded, and I hope in a future work to do this, for I am well aware that scarcely a single point is discussed in this volume on which facts cannot be adduced, often apparently leading to conclusions directly opposite to those at which I have arrived. A fair result can be obtained only by fully stating and balancing the facts and arguments on both sides of questions, and this is here impossible. I much regret that want of space prevents my having the satisfaction of acknowledging the generous assistance which I have received from very many naturalists, some of them personally unknown to me. I cannot, however, let this opportunity pass without expressing my deep obligation to Dr. Hooker, who for the last 15 years have aided me in every possible way by his large stores of knowledge and his excellent judgment. In considering the origin of species, it is quite conceivable that a naturalist, reflecting on the mutual affinities of organic beings, on their embryological relations, their geographical distribution, geological succession, and other such facts, might come to the conclusion that species had not been independently created, but had descended like varieties from other species. Nevertheless, such a conclusion, even if well founded, would be unsatisfactory until it could be shown how the innumerable species inhabiting this world have been modified so as to acquire that perfection of structure and co-adaptation which justly excites our admiration. Naturalists continually refer to external conditions such as climate, food, etc. as the only possible cause of variation. In one limited sense, as we shall hereafter see, this may be true, but it is prosperous to attribute to mere external conditions the structure, for instance, of the woodpecker, with its feet, tail, beak, and tongue, so admirably adapted to catch insects under the bark of trees. In the case of the mistletoe, which draws its nourishment from certain trees, which has seed that must be transported by certain birds, and which has flower with separate sexes, absolutely requiring the agency of certain insects to bring pollen from one flower to the other. It is equally prosperous to account for the structure of this parasite with its relation to several distinct organic beings by the effect of external condition or of habit or of volition of the plant itself. It is therefore of the highest importance to gain a clear insight into the means of modification and co-adaptation. At the commencement of my observation, it seemed to me probable that a careful study of domesticated animals and of cultivated plants would offer the best chance of making out this obscure problem. Nor have I been disappointed. In this and in all other perplexing cases, I have invariably found that our knowledge, imperfect though it be, of variation under domestication afforded the best and safest clue. I may venture to express my conviction of the high value of such studies, although they have been very commonly neglected by naturalists. From this consideration, I shall devote the first chapter of this abstract to variation under domestication. We shall thus see that a large amount of hereditary modification is at least possible, and what is equally or more important, we shall see how great is the power of man in accumulating by selection successive slight variations. Man in I will then pass on to the variability of species in a state of nature, but I shall unfortunately be compelled to treat this subject far too briefly, as it can be treated properly only by giving long catalogues of facts. We shall, however, be enabled to discuss what circumstances are most favorable to variation. In the next chapter, the struggle for existence among all organic beings throughout the world, which inevitably follows from the high geometrical ratio of their increase, will be considered. This is the doctrine of Malthus applied to the whole animal and vegetable kingdoms. As many more individuals of each species are born than can possibly survive, and as consequently there is a frequently recurring struggle for existence, it follows that any being, if it vary, however slightly in any manner profitable to itself, under the complex and sometimes varying condition of life, will have a better chance of surviving and thus be naturally selected. From the strong principle of inheritance, any selected variety will tend to propagate its new and modified form. This fundamental subject of natural selection will be treated at some length in the fourth chapter, and we shall then see how natural selection almost inevitably causes much extinction of the less improved forms of life and lead to what I have called divergence of character. In the next chapter, I shall discuss the complex and little known laws of variation. In the 5 succeeding chapters, the most apparent and gravest difficulties in accepting the theory will be given, namely, first, the difficulties of transitions, or how a simple being or a simple organ can be changed and perfected into a highly developed being or into an elaborated constructed organ. Secondly, the subject of instinct or the mental power of animals. Thirdly, hybridism or the infertility of species and the fertility of varieties when intercrossed. And fourthly, the imperfection of the zoological record. In the next chapter, I shall consider the zoological succession of organic beings throughout time. In the 12th and 13th, their zoological distribution throughout space. In the 14th, their classification or mutual affinities, both when mature and in an embryonic condition. In the last chapters, I shall give a brief recapitulation of the whole work and a few concluding remarks. No one ought to feel surprised at much remaining as yet unexplained in regard to the origin of species and varieties, if we make due allowance for our profound ignorance in regard to the mutual relations of the many beings which live around us. Who can explain why one species ranges widely and is very numerous, and why another allied species has a narrow range and it is rare? Yet these relations are of the highest importance, for they determine the present welfare and as I believe the future success and modification of every inhabitant of this world. Still less do we know the mutual relations of the innumerable inhabitants of the world during the many past geological epochs in its history. Although much remains obscure and will long remain obscure, I can entertain no doubt, after the most deliberate study and dispassionate judgment of which I am capable, that the view which most naturalists until recently entertained, and which I formerly entertained, namely that each species has been independently created, is erroneous. I am fully convinced that species are not immutable, but that those belonging to what are called the same genera are lineal descendants of some other and generally extinct species, in the same manner as the acknowledged varieties of any one species are the descendants of that species. Furthermore, I am convinced that natural selection has been the most important but not the exclusive means of modification. The introduction is ended. Thank you for being till end with me. In next episode, we will start its first chapter, variation under domestication. So please listen it carefully in next episode. Again, thanks. Jai Hind, Jai Bharat.